This is one of those times when I usually draw this on the board, and then I draw more notes and you draw more notes, but we can't do this on a board together. So I'm going to do my best to make some sloppy notes for you on top of some crappy drawing that I photographed. I hope you'll forgive me. I know that this is clumsy. There are 6 types of logging, 6 forms of forest management that I want to talk about. And I usually have a lot of writing on the screen, but on this screen, I just had this drawing. So I'll be saying some stuff. Okay. So first of all, clear cut is where you have a whole bunch of trees standing and you cut them all down. Now this is across the landscape. We used to do this manually. Nowadays, there's special machines. They're like chainsaw, bulldozer, excavator, weed whackers. So it's a big old machine with tracks and an arm, and it has these like chainsaw bars. And so it'll clamp a log, cut it down, or rather separate it from the ground. Then it turns sideways and the log moves through a machine that strips all the branches off it. And then you put it down on a logging truck and you move to the next tree. And basically you just cut down everything. And I want you to put this in your notes. Everything, 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 everything. Little trees, big trees, old trees, dead trees, other stuff, shrubbery, wrong trees. You cut it all down. Clear cut. Sounds like a lot of work, right? But it turns out this is by far the cheapest way to log because it's extremely safe and it's rapid. You just cut it and tip it over and cut it and tip it over and cut it and tip it over, and you never look around and you don't have to get picky. You never even have to get out of the machine. There's usually nobody on the ground. It's just all big machines. If you've ever seen an excavator move stuff around in a building site, it's just moving through the forest, hundreds of acres a day per machine. It's extremely efficient. I may have exaggerated, dozens of acres a day per machine. Now, most efficient, least labor, and by the way, safest. Because if you get rid of everything, there's nothing left to fall over on you. You just cut the stuff away from you and it's always falling away from you, and there's no risk to the loggers. So fast, efficient, cheap, and safe. This is the leading type of logging worldwide. You got to put leading. Now, this is number 1 for the cheap, safety, whatever. It's also the worst possible option for the environment. This is a catastrophic ecosystem event, like a forest fire or a volcanic eruption. Remember we talked about succession? Clear cuts are erasing an ecosystem, like a volcano. You leave the dirt usually, but nothing else. You get rid of all habitat, so you lose all biodiversity, and then you're hoping that things will grow back before the rain takes away all the dirt. If not, you have one of the largest erosion issues on Earth. This is one of the primary sources of sediment pollution in water. Remember the twofold problem of erosion? When you lose the soil in one place and it ends up somewhere else. So it makes it harder for the forest to recover. Clear cuts are horrible, bad for river quality, bad for salmon, bad for the ocean. Soil loss from the erosion that can extend recovery times. And so you have not only the biodiversity impact, but the extended recovery. You know, sometimes if you want to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. This is the world's leading forestry practice because of the safety, efficiency, and low cost. Now, there are other types of logging, but I should mention that they have a name you should know, but they're not really viable. So shelterwood logging is really just maintaining the forest. And this is a tricky thing for you to put into your notes. The only trees that you cut away are the sick and the dead trees. So basically, this is just taking the stuff that's least relevant. Now, dead trees are still habitat for a bunch of organisms, and dead trees will decompose to enrich the soil. But the idea here is you're taking just the dead or sick trees. This is usually a way to make your forest nicer. In seed tree logging, this is a total clear cut where you just leave a few big mama trees. You just leave the mamas. You know, so that they will drop seeds and help the forest grow back. Imagine if I wanted to grow redwood, I could clear cut the forest, but if I leave a couple of big old redwoods, then they're going to sprinkle seeds onto the dirt and accelerate the recovery. So this is a clear cut with accelerated recovery by leaving a few moms to drop seeds. Those are called seed trees. So that's called seed tree cutting or seed tree clear cutting. Selective is what all the hippies want. Most of the forest is not usable. You might find this surprising, but most of the forest has trees that are split, trees that are crooked, trees that got hit by lightning, trees that are tangled, trees that are of undesirable species. So most of the forest, when you go walking through a forest, that's not really valued as timber. When a logger looks at a forest, they see a bunch of trash with a couple $1,000 and a couple $1,000 over here. So selective logging is the concept that you would leave the entire forest alone, be selective, and just take the few trees that have a value. And for people who don't know anything about logging, that sounds like a great idea. Leave the entire forest, take a couple trees per acre. That's great for ecosystems. Come on, logger. You don't have to waste your time with the other stuff. But you tell this to a logger, and the logger's like, no way. Selective logging is impossible. And all the hippies get mad, right? Like, come on, bro, leave the forest. Just take the ones you need. But that's not how it works. That is so sketchy. For a logger to fell a valuable tree surrounded by other trees is like a no-go proposition. No logger would ever do that. I drop a lot of trees, and that sounds so scary because on the way down, you're going to snap other trees and tangle them up, and they shoot off sideways in all directions, and your big log can bounce funny, and people die. It's no joke. Logging is one of the most dangerous jobs in America, by the way. And so selective sounds great, impossible, too risky, and by the way, too expensive. How the heck are you going to get that log out of there through a forest, right? Like we're going to like helicopter in and like remove one log. That would become a $40,000 log, right? So selective logging sounds great, never going to happen. Thinning is to make the forest more sparse. So you'll notice we cut out 2 out of every 3 or so. Now, technically, small fires do this. Small fires tend to eat up the little stuff and the dead stuff, but they don't tend to reach the big trees. So in many parts, especially in the American West, where fires are natural, little fires move through the forest all the time. They don't generate a lot of heat. The flames are low. So these fires just eat up the brush and they keep the forest thinned out. So you got a big old tree 60 yards away, you got another big tree. But we've been preventing fires in the American West for about 100 years now. So our forests are too thick, they're dense, they're overgrown. This is just because we prevented fires in the past. And so thinning is a way to recover natural forest ecosystems, but it's not really profitable, right? You usually have to pay loggers to do all this, and they're not making money. This isn't to collect logs for sale on the market. This is just to remove stuff that's overgrown. So thinning is more about fire policy. It's not really logging. There aren't usually logs. So I will talk about thinning in a separate study goal where we talk about fire policy in this unit. It's coming up in like 4 or 5 study goals or something. But I'd like you to add one little note in the thinning that sometimes, especially in Alaska, we've done a trade where we tell a logging company, you can take the logs from that acre if you'll thin for me this acre. So you take the forest that is around a city or a highway and you pay a logging company to thin out that forest as a way of preventing forest fires from being too devastating. And you pay them with the logs further back in the forest. Like back there, nobody's going to look. So even though this is public land, it's like a mitigation thing where we can't afford to thin, Alaska's big forest. So instead, go ahead and log a little bit, but do some thinning work for us where it's really critical. So thinning can be tied to logging in some cases. The thinning itself is not the logging. You let a lumber company do some logging in exchange for them doing some thinning somewhere else. And finally, strip cutting is like a patterned clear cut. So the idea goes that if you do a clear cut, then leave some forest, do another clear cut, leave some forest, in strips. The idea goes that a lot of the problems of clear cutting can be resolved, right? Because you're going to get less erosion because the soil is sort of trapped by the strips. Does that make sense? And you've got some habitat left. Look at my arrows. That's still habitat. So a lot of this wildlife just kind of packs into this part of the forest, right? And then you've got all these trees that can provide seeds, right? So this will recover pretty fast. And once your clear-cut areas have recovered, now you could come through and you could clear cut. Oh man, I'm really messing up. Now you could clear cut. Why this doesn't work? Sorry. So now you can clear cut here. Sorry, what I was trying to show here, I guess I messed up my markers. What I was trying to show here is that this is like an alternating clear cut, where you clear cut a strip and then it's protected by a strip of healthy forest next to it. So that kind of fixes the habitat issue, the recovery issue, and the erosion issue, but you still get to clear cut. In the United States, where we do so much logging and it used to be all clear cuts, now we've kind of switched. Now we do a lot more strip cutting, which is just a patterned clear cut. Do some clear cuts here, come back in 20 years, and these will be growing, so you can clear cut those. Wait another 20 years and you can go back to the first ones. Okay, so it's like a checkerboard pattern clear cut. With all these practices, you kind of have to wonder what's sustainable. It doesn't say it anywhere on this screen, but you had a study goal and a vocab term about sustainable forestry. And you got to wonder, how do we do this sustainably? So worldwide, almost all logging is clear cuts. And worldwide, most of that is original, virgin, old growth forest. That destroys habitat, it cripples diversity, it lets out a whole bunch of carbon that used to be stored in that forest, it accelerates erosion. Now, in the United States, we're starting to do less and less clear cutting. We're doing more and more strip cutting, which is just smaller clear cuts. But I'd like to first of all clear up a word. When I say old growth, I don't mean old trees. I mean old forest. And if you go to an old forest, some trees are old, but if nobody's been messing around, trees died of old age, trees had babies, some trees are young, some are medium age, some are old, some are really ancient, some are dead on the ground rotting, and there's a whole bunch of different species. That's old growth. It's original forest or native forest. And these are huge reservoirs of carbon and huge reservoirs of biodiversity. In many places, they also have a lot of cultural value. They may be tied to older nations. They may be tied to religious practice. They may support fisheries that are otherwise culturally important. And so we've got this interesting question. Should we keep cutting those down, or should we farm our forests? Is it better to turn a forest into a farm, or what? I want to remind you that tree farms are often even aged and single species. A group of trees is called a stand. So we say an even aged stand is a whole bunch of 20-year-old trees that are all the same size and shape. Very easy to log, but not a lot of diversity of habitat, right? There's also single species dominant forest. Like the forest here behind my kids, that's one species. That's just a naturally single species forest. But when you're farming them, you just want to grow one type of tree, right? Like Doug fir or yellow pine or whatever. So if they're all the same age and they're all the same species, that's super uniform. That's a monoculture, like Kansas that just has corn. That's the same problems that you would expect with a monoculture that's begging for insects to move in. The same nutrients are being used up across the entire landscape because you're only growing one thing. And there's really very little or no natural diversity. It's just a monoculture, no ecosystem value. You know, we're farming, so at least we're not chewing up forest, but then again, it's not like we're getting a forest. The farm is the opposite of a forest. There's no diversity. And there's interesting questions about how tree farms soak up carbon faster, but then again, they have a lower density of biomass, so they store less carbon per acre. I'm not getting to an answer with this. I just mean to say that there's a really hot debate about which is better. If you log old forest and then you go away, at least it might recover and you just represent a single natural disaster, but biodiversity might return. If you take that spot that used to be a forest and turn it into a tree farm, it's basically a parking lot with lumber standing up. That's not an ecosystem. You've lost the biological value of the forest when you make it into a tree farm. So whether we're logging native trees or whether we are farming them, neither is a really good answer, but humans need a lot of forest products. We use a ton, especially we rich countries. So there is a really fascinating and interesting and heated debate about how to manage forests sustainably. And basically everybody argues their point, but there are very rational trade-offs on both sides. It's a really sticky question. Thanks for letting me babble so much. I think I'm done for today.